Walter Greene was an old black man who had spent most of his life punching time cards, swallowing insults and carrying other people's burdens on his shoulders. Long before the world accused him of crimes he didn't commit, long before his shackled hands trembled in a courtroom full of strangers, he had once chosen to change two young lives he found trembling in an icy alley. That choice would one day return, not as a memory but as salvation. But before we begin, if this is your first time hearing one of our stories, we'd love for you to subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more powerful true-to-life tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Stick with us until the end, and if this story touches your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. Now, let's start at the beginning. The winter that year was the kind that gnawed through fabric and skin. The kind of cold that made people walk faster, heads tucked into scarves, ignoring anything that didn't directly stand in their way. Chimneys spit out gray smoke, the metal of old fire escapes froze like brittle bones, and the narrow streets of the worn-down industrial district carried the smell of steel, fatigue, and something like hopelessness. Walter limped through those streets every evening after his shift at the foundry. He was in his late 50s, though life had aged him far beyond that. His right knee never recovered after an accident 20 years earlier. The company doctor had chalked it up as manageable and sent him back to work within the week. The pain had stayed ever since, a constant reminder of how little men like him mattered to the world. His boss, Mr. Harlan, often called him slow, useless, or lucky to even have a job. Walter never argued. Men like Harlan didn't want explanations, they wanted targets. And Walter had grown used to taking blows that weren't physical. You can't fire back at a man who signs your paycheck, not when rent is due and food isn't guaranteed. That evening, frost clung to every window as Walter passed the back of the diner. The alley was dark except for the buzzing freezer vents that leaked steam into the air. He would have walked by like usual, tired, hungry, wishing for heat, but tonight something caught his attention. Two shapes lay curled beside the dumpster. So too small. Walter stopped. The alley wind hissed, whipping his coat as he leaned closer. The shapes moved slightly. Children. A boy holding a much younger girl against his chest, trying to shield her from the biting cold. Their clothes were threadbare, barely cloth anymore, their hair stiff with winter's breath. Walter felt something deep inside him twist. "You two got somewhere warm to go?" he asked, voice gentle, throat tight. The boy shook his head. He looked ready to run but too weak to actually do it. The girl didn't speak at all, she just stared at Walter with eyes far too old for her tiny frame. Walter exhaled. His breath fogged in the air like a cloud of confusion and pain. He could have walked away. He didn't have food for himself most nights. His heater barely worked. His boss constantly reminded him he was one step away from homelessness. And part of him knew Harlan's cruel voice wasn't wrong. Walter lived paycheck to paycheck. He didn't have room or money for children who weren't his. But he also knew what it felt like to be left behind. To be invisible. "No one sleeps out here tonight," he murmured. He held out a hand. "Come on." The boy hesitated. But the girl, shivering and exhausted, slowly reached out and placed her tiny fingers into Walter's rough, work-scarred palm. That was all it took. Walter's building was old enough to groan whenever the wind blew. Peeling paint clung to the walls like curled feathers. Neighbors peeked from half-open doors as he led the two children upstairs. "That fool," one whispered. "Can't keep his own lights on," another scoffed. "He'll sink with them." Walter heard it all. He always heard everything. He just didn't react anymore. Inside his apartment, warmth was more idea than reality. The old radiator rattled and coughed like it needed medical attention. But Walter dug out blankets, set them on his sagging couch, and warmed a pot of broth that barely counted as a meal. The children devoured it like they hadn't eaten in days. "What's your name, son?" Walter asked softly. The boy hesitated, then said, "Eli." "And your sister?" "Grace," he whispered, brushing her hair out of her face. Walter nodded. "You two can stay tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure things out." He didn't sleep much. He sat on his old recliner rubbing his aching knee, thinking about how everything would be harder now. Rent, food, work. But he also looked at the two children bundled on his couch and knew this. They were safer than they had been before. That was enough for him. The days that followed became a test of strength. Walter dragged himself to the steel factory every morning before dawn. The air there always smelled like hot iron and sweat. Machinery clanged relentlessly, shaking the ground until you felt it in your ribs. Harlan, the factory supervisor, thrived on belittling people, especially Walter. One morning he waited for the perfect moment, when the factory floor had fallen almost silent, before shouting, "Greene." Even those strays you dragged home could work faster than you. Laughter rose around the factory. Some workers laughed because they found it funny. Others laughed because they were afraid not to. Walter simply wiped his brow and continued stacking metal sheets. He didn't give Harlan the satisfaction of reacting. But every insult was a stone added to the invisible weight he carried. And every night he limped home with that weight pressing harder on his bones. Yet as soon as he opened the apartment door, the weight eased. Eli would run up with a schoolbook, eager to show what he'd learned. Grace would sit at the shaky kitchen table drawing pictures with the little crayons Walter had found at a thrift shop. He gave them his food, patched Eli's torn jacket with clumsy stitching, saved coins so Grace could have better shoes. When the heater died altogether some nights, he huddled them close and pretended he wasn't freezing too. The neighbors talked. They always talked. A black man raising 2 white kids? It'll blow up in his face, one woman muttered. He'll regret this, said another. Walter didn't answer. His entire life had taught him to pick battles carefully, and these kids were the only battle that mattered. Eli grew into a sharp-minded young teenager who devoured books like air. He could spot unfairness from a mile away, thanks to watching Walter bend under the world's pressure for years. Grace found her voice too, discovering a talent for debate and storytelling. Walter worked overtime, skipped meals, sold the little jewelry left from his mother just to keep them stable. When Grace needed to visit a clinic, Walter asked Harlan for a day off. You're not their father, Harlan snapped. Stop playing hero and get back to work. Walter still took the day. It cost him half a paycheck. But he never complained. He carried every hardship silently, because seeing Eli and Grace grow stronger made the suffering bearable. Years passed. The children grew. Their shoulders straightened. Their ambitions expanded beyond the cramped walls of Walter's apartment. And when college acceptance letters finally came, Walter cried quietly in the bathroom so the kids wouldn't see. Eli earned scholarships for law. Grace found her path in journalism. Walter pinned their letters to his peeling walls like trophies, but Harlan was watching too. And the older the children grew, the more Harlan's resentment festered. One autumn morning, when the trees outside rattled red and gold, Walter returned home from an early shift to find 2 police officers waiting outside his building. His heart sank. Walter Greene? Yes, officers. We need to ask you some questions. Then they walked inside. They searched everything. Ripped open cushions. Pulled out drawers. Tossed his belongings onto the floor. From under his sofa, they pulled a small bag, stuffed with cash and factory tools stamped with company labels. Walter staggered back. I've never seen that before. Save it, one officer said. We've had reports. Within minutes, cold metal cuffs were snapped around his wrists. The entire neighborhood watched. I told you, a neighbor muttered. He looked decent, but they always slip eventually. Outside the factory, Harlan stood with arms crossed, smirking as Walter was shoved into the police car. Guess kindness doesn't pay, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Some workers laughed. Others looked away. Walter lowered his head. A lifetime of dignity drained through his fingertips. The courtroom smelled of old wood and something stale, like justice that had expired long ago. Walter sat hunched, wrists cuffed, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The prosecutor painted him as a bitter old man who had stolen from the company out of desperation. Witnesses, carefully chosen by Harlan, claimed they'd seen Walter sneaking around with tools. One said Walter had money troubles. Another said he'd always seemed suspicious. It was all lies and Walter knew it. But lies have a way of convincing people when whispered with confidence. The gallery murmured. I knew he wasn't what he pretended to be. He fooled those kids he raised. You can't trust people who look desperate. Walter's silence didn't help him. But years of swallowing humiliation had taught him one thing. Don't speak until you're sure someone will listen. The judge raised the gavel. Walter braced himself. A life sentence for a crime he never committed. His chest tightened. His vision blurred. Maybe Harlan was right. Maybe men like him weren't meant to rise. But just before the gavel fell, the back doors of the courtroom opened. 2 figures stepped inside. Confident. Unshaken. Not children anymore. Eli. Grace. And everything began to change. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they swung open, slicing through the courtroom's tension like a blade. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled. Even the judge paused mid-motion, gavel hovering in the air. 2 figures stepped inside, not the shivering children Walter once found curled beside a dumpster, but confident adults shaped by the very sacrifices he thought no one had noticed. Eli walked with the assuredness of a man who had learned how to stand up to injustice. His suit wasn't expensive, but he wore it like armor. A folder stuffed with legal documents rested under his arm. Grace followed, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and a recorder in her hand, its red light blinking like a warning signal. Walter's breath hitched. He hadn't wanted them to see him like this. But they were here. For him. Eli stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said firmly, voice echoing across the room, "I'm representing the defendant, Walter Greene." The prosecutor blinked, caught off guard. "This is highly irregular." "Not illegal," Eli countered, laying down a stack of files onto the defense table. "And certainly not as irregular as framing an innocent man." A wave of whispers surged through the courtroom. Harlan, seated behind the prosecution, stiffened. His jaw tightened. His smirk vanished. Grace positioned herself near the gallery. She scanned every face, her recorder capturing every shift, every reaction, every tremble in the voices around her. Her articles had exposed corrupt landlords, forged contracts, and crooked city officials. Today her focus landed squarely on Harlan. Eli's voice sharpened as he began dismantling the prosecutor's case. Witness by witness he stripped away the lies. One worker admitted he only heard rumors. Another buckled under pressure, contradicting his own earlier testimony. A third finally whispered that Harlan had hinted there would be rewards for cooperation. The room stirred again, this time louder. Then Grace stood. "Your Honor, I have a report to submit," she announced. "A detailed investigation of the factory's financial misconduct, employee exploitation, and falsified accounts." She handed over a folder thick with printed evidence, pages stamped with dates, signatures, and internal memos she had obtained through months of digging. Harlan surged to his feet. "This is an outrage. She's fabricating." "No," Grace said sharply. "You are. And you've been doing it for years." The judge flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing with every sheet he turned. The courtroom leaned forward, hanging on each movement. The prosecutor cleared his throat, suddenly pale. "This appears relevant," the judge murmured. "Highly relevant." Walter sat motionless, hardly breathing. Was this really happening? The children he had once fed with scraps now stood stronger than anyone in the room. Eli stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, my father?" Walter's eyes widened. "Has been the target of a malicious setup. The evidence planted in his home matches the items documented as missing the exact day Harlan oversaw the storage room alone. We have timestamps. We have employee records. And we have motive." Gasps broke across the room. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Walter for a long, heavy moment. Then he turned to Harlan. "Mr. Harlan, be aware that what I am seeing here suggests deliberate manipulation of this court." Harlan froze. Silence. Then the judge lifted his gavel, this time with calm finality. "Charges against Walter Greene are hereby dismissed." The sound echoed like thunder. Some spectators clapped. Others shouted in outrage. A few jeered at Harlan as he scrambled out of the courtroom, face red with defeat. Eli rested a steady hand on Walter's shoulder. Grace moved beside him, her voice soft but unshakable. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore," she whispered. "Dad." Walter's breath shattered in his chest. That. A word no court, no gossiping neighbor, no vindictive boss could ever take from him. Tears blurred his vision as he slowly stood, no longer small, no longer defeated. For the first time in years, he lifted his head fully, shoulders straightening as if something long broken had finally healed. People who once whispered about him now watched in stunned silence. Eli and Grace flanked him on each side. And together they walked out into the open air, free. What Walter didn't yet know was this: the battle might be over, but the world was about to hear the full truth. Because Grace's pen wasn't finished and Eli's fire hadn't cooled. The man who had raised them from scraps would soon see justice echo far beyond the courtroom walls. The night grew colder as Lena and Marcus followed the narrow tunnel hidden beneath the old well. The air thickened, carrying the scent of earth and iron. At the end of the passage, a wooden door waited, its surface carved with initials and dates from a century past. Marcus pushed it open. Inside was a small underground room, lined with shelves, old trunks, and a single lantern that flickered like it had been waiting for them. Lena stepped forward, her breath catching as she lifted the lid of the first trunk. Stacks of documents. Bound ledgers. Maps. But it was the sealed envelope on top that froze Marcus in place. His grandfather's handwriting. For the rightful heirs. Lena opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, and a deed. A deed proving that the land everyone thought was worthless wasn't just farmland. It sat on top of one of the largest unclaimed mineral deposits in the county. Gold. Rare earth metals. Enough wealth to change entire dynasties. Marcus swallowed hard, his voice rough. My grandfather wasn't poor, he was protecting this. Lena reached for his hand. And now it belongs to you. To us. Above them, the storm rumbled as if warning what would come next. Because news like this doesn't stay buried. Not when her parents, who disowned her and mocked Marcus's family, were already sniffing around, desperate and drowning in debt. And by morning the world would know the truth. The land they laughed at, the man they rejected, the daughter they threw away, now held the power to make every one of them kneel. But the deeper they dug into those trunks, the more they realized. The treasure wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning.